Listen closely. There are rooms in history that were sealed not to protect the dead but to protect the living from what they might realize about power. What you're about to hear was never meant to survive ink, breath, or memory. And once you hear it, you won't unhear it. Beneath the whitewashed holiness of colonial America, there existed a quieter architecture than churches and courthouses. An architecture of obedience, of silence, of belief weaponized so completely that men surrendered their instincts, their morality, even their bodies, without ever being touched by a sword. This story begins inside one of those structures where purity was enforced, not practiced, and where control dressed itself as God. In 1748, Savannah was still pretending to be righteous. The sermons spoke of restraint. The laws spoke of order. But the economy spoke only one language: domination. And religious institutions, far from resisting it, had learned how to sanctify it. They owned land. They owned bodies. They owned narratives. And when something threatened that narrative, it wasn't confronted, it was buried. At the center of this descent stands a woman trained to enforce discipline so absolute that even thought felt dangerous in her presence. She was not weak. She was not confused. She was not naive. She understood power intimately, how to apply it, how to extract compliance, how to make others police themselves. That is what made what followed so destabilizing. Because when her body changed, when evidence appeared that could not be reconciled with doctrine, the institution did not ask whether something had gone wrong. It asked only one question: how do we control the meaning of this? What the public was eventually told was simple, elegant, sacred, a miracle. But miracles, when examined too closely, often reveal machinery underneath. And this one exposed something far more dangerous than hypocrisy. It revealed a system capable of rewriting reality itself using faith as the pen. And there was a second figure in this story. Young, educated just enough to be useful, invisible enough to be disposable, owned by the very institution that would later erase him. He existed in the margins of holy spaces, permitted access not because he was trusted but because he was underestimated. This is not a story about scandal. It's a story about control, psychological, spiritual, institutional, about how belief systems are engineered to protect authority at any cost, and about what happens when truth threatens to wake the wrong people. Stay with me. We're only at the outer door. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the convent not as a sanctuary but as a machine. Every rule, every bell, every ritual was calibrated to produce obedience. Silence was not a virtue there. It was a technology. The women inside learned quickly that survival meant internalizing authority so completely that external enforcement became unnecessary. You didn't break vows because you were watched. You didn't break vows because you stopped imagining the possibility. That was Sister Marie's true talent. She didn't merely enforce discipline, she reprogrammed it. Under her reforms, the convent ceased to be a place of faith and became a closed system. Schedules were weaponized. Confession was no longer spiritual cleansing. It was surveillance. Deviations were logged. Patterns were analyzed. Human behavior was reduced to data long before the word existed. And yet, the machine required labor. Quiet, invisible labor. The kind that did not question why holy books needed copying at midnight or why storage chapels required frequent inspection by only one woman. That labor belonged to the enslaved. Thomas was not permitted belief-only function. His literacy, rare and dangerous, placed him inside the nerve center of the institution. He handled records. He copied correspondence. He moved between rooms where truth lived on paper long before it was spoken aloud. He saw what others were trained not to see: inconsistencies, revisions, letters that contradicted sermons. What made him valuable also made him vulnerable. He existed outside doctrine. He had no vows to protect him, no soul according to the law that the institution was required to preserve. And that is precisely why he was safe to involve. Here is the first suppressed truth. Power does not corrupt randomly. It selects, chooses the invisible. It experiments where no one will look. When Sister Marie altered her routines, no one questioned it, not because it made sense, but because authority had conditioned them not to question her. When she entered restricted spaces, the locks opened. When she requested privacy, it was granted. And when biological reality asserted itself in a way doctrine could not explain, the institution did not panic. Calculated, because this was not the first time belief had collided with biology. It was simply the first time the collision threatened to expose the mechanism beneath the miracle. And mechanisms, once seen, cannot be unseen. The Church's response was not moral outrage. It was risk assessment, reputation, containment. Every letter sent to Charleston carried the same subtext. This must not become precedent. Not because it was sinful, but because it was explainable. You see, faith survives mystery. Authority does not survive understanding. The physicians were summoned not to heal, but to verify. And when they confirmed the obvious, that this was a natural pregnancy, the institution faced a choice. Admit corruption or manufacture transcendence. One path would collapse trust. The other would reinforce it. So they chose myth. But myths require unanimity, and unanimity requires silence. The interrogations were not about discovering truth. They were about testing compliance. Sister Marie passed every test because she understood the game. She did not argue biology. She reframed it. She did not deny evidence. She elevated it. She positioned herself not as a sinner but as a symbol. And symbols are dangerous, because once authority turns a person into a symbol, it becomes impossible to hold them accountable without destabilizing the entire structure built around them. This is where Thomas becomes essential. The Church could discredit a nun, could exile her, could bury her in a remote abbey and seal the records, but it could not allow a narrative that implicated institutional planning, intellectual misconduct, and the exploitation of enslaved bodies for experimental ends, because that would reveal the second suppressed truth, that religious institutions did not merely coexist with systems of domination, they innovated within them. Artificial conception was not pursued out of curiosity. It was pursued out of control. Control over lineage, over purity, over legacy. A child born without physical transgression preserved vows while bypassing nature. It was the perfect loophole. And Thomas educated, owned, and silenced was the perfect instrument. When he confessed, he did not accuse. He explained. Calmly, precisely. He described instructions, timing, isolation. He described how obedience was extracted without force through fear, reverence, and the absolute certainty that refusal was not an option. His testimony was never meant to survive. And yet, fragments did, because someone hesitated before burning the letters. At this point in the descent, I need you to do something not for me, but for yourself. Because awareness is not passive. It requires declaration. In the comments, write this phrase twice. I see the pattern. Write it again. I see the pattern. Not as superstition, as alignment. Because what you're seeing now is not confined to the 18th century. The records that survived were sealed not because they disproved faith, but because they exposed method. The Church realized something dangerous. Belief could be engineered. Bodies could be managed. Doctrine could be bent without breaking as long as the narrative was controlled. Sister Marie was removed quietly, officially sent on retreat. The child was never baptized publicly. No birth record exists in Savannah. Thomas was sold south within months. His literacy noted as problematic. His name disappears from all convent inventories. But the technique did not disappear. This is the fourth suppressed truth. Institutions do not abandon successful control systems, they refine them. What began as theological justification became psychological architecture. Guilt replaced chains. Confession replaced interrogation. Identity replaced enforcement. Men learned to doubt themselves before doubting authority, to feel shame for instincts that threatened compliance, to surrender agency in exchange for belonging. And the most effective part? The belief that submission was chosen. You were never meant to learn this story because it reveals how easily morality can be redirected when wrapped in sanctity. How often divine will has been invoked to excuse logistical planning. How many systems still operate on the same principles just with better branding. This knowledge is dangerous because it gives you something institutions cannot tolerate: discernment. Once you recognize the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. And that is when the real discomfort begins. After the chapel was sealed, Savannah moved on. Scandals always fade when power decides they will. New sermons were preached. New students enrolled. New enslaved workers replaced the old. The surface healed. The structure remained intact. But something shifted beneath it. The letters that survived those 23 pages, never fully destroyed, circulated quietly among a very small circle. Not as heresy, as instruction. They demonstrated how belief could override evidence, how authority could redefine violation as virtue, how institutions could commit acts no individual would dare, then absolve themselves through ritual. This is the final truth for tonight. Corruption does not announce itself with chaos. It arrives as order taken too far. The nun was not an anomaly. The enslaved boy was not an exception. They were components in a system that valued outcomes over ethics and narratives over lives. And if you think this story ended in 1749, you haven't been paying attention. Look around. Look at how institutions speak when they are threatened. Look at how often greater good replaces accountability. Look at how frequently inconvenient truths are reframed as misunderstandings, conspiracies, or attacks on tradition. History doesn't repeat itself because people forget. It repeats because systems remember. And now, so do you. Once a man understands how power actually operates, how it manipulates belief, identity, and guilt, he cannot return to innocence. He becomes harder to program, harder to silence, harder to control. That is why this knowledge was buried. And that is why it still matters. What happened after the records were sealed is where most accounts fall silent, but silence itself is a clue. When institutions erase outcomes, they preserve processes. And the process revealed here did not die with Sister Marie or vanish with Thomas. It migrated. In the decades that followed, similar patterns surfaced across colonial America and Europe. Religious orphanages with unexplained funding. Miracle births quietly relocated. Children absorbed into church-run schools with no lineage, no past, no claim to inheritance. Each case treated as isolated. Each wrapped in language of charity. None examined as a system, because systems hide best when they fragment responsibility. The convent in Savannah was an early laboratory not of faith, but of social engineering. It demonstrated that authority could bypass moral constraints if it controlled interpretation, that biology could be overridden by narrative, that exploitation could be reframed as obedience, and that the most effective control did not rely on violence but on internalized belief. This is the architecture that later institutions refined. Seminaries, military academies, boarding schools, even corporate hierarchies. Strip identity, replace it with doctrine, reward compliance, sanctify sacrifice, punish deviation not with force but with shame. Thomas understood this before anyone else. That is why he broke not loudly, not rebelliously but inwardly. His refusal to eat, his silence, his trembling hands were not fear of punishment. They were the realization that truth, once spoken, does not liberate everyone. Sometimes it only clarifies how trapped you are. And that is the cruel paradox buried in this story. The church did not fear exposure because it had sinned. It feared exposure because it had succeeded. Succeeded in proving that men and women could be convinced to violate their own moral instincts if authority spoke with enough certainty. succeeded in proving that ownership of narrative mattered more than ownership of bodies, succeeded in proving that belief, once conditioned, becomes self-sustaining. This is why dangerous knowledge is always framed as heresy or madness. Not because it's false, but because it dissolves obedience. And obedience, once lost, cannot be easily reclaimed. If you're still listening, understand this. The descent is no longer historical. It's personal. Because the same psychological mechanics exposed in that sealed chapel are still active. They govern what men feel permitted to question, what doubts are labeled weakness, what instincts are suppressed in the name of virtue, productivity, or loyalty. Modern institutions no longer need miracles. They need compliance disguised as purpose. They teach men to outsource conscience, to defer judgment, to trust systems that claim moral authority while operating on incentives entirely divorced from ethics. And when contradictions arise, the response is always the same. Reinterpret, reframe, redirect. That's what Sister Marie did instinctively. She did not deny reality. She rebranded it. She spoke with enough conviction that doubt became sacrilegious. That is how authority survives contradiction. It does not argue. It declares. And most people accept declarations because certainty is comforting. But here is the awakening embedded in this story. Certainty is not truth. It is a tool. Once you see how easily certainty can be manufactured, you begin to notice when it's used against you. In media, in institutions, in ideologies that demand allegiance but forbid scrutiny, in narratives that shame you for asking the wrong questions. This knowledge sharpens perception, and sharpened perception is threatening. That is why men who wake up are often labeled cynical, dangerous, or unstable. Because they no longer respond predictably. They no longer mistake authority for legitimacy. The church buried the scandal because it revealed that sanctity could be simulated, that belief could be orchestrated, that men could be convinced to betray their own senses if the cost of resistance felt too high. You are not meant to live inside that architecture, and once you recognize it, you cannot unknow it. The final truth is the hardest to accept because it places responsibility back where institutions work hardest to remove it. Nothing changes unless men choose to see. The convent doors were sealed, the letters hidden, the child erased. Thomas disappeared into a system designed to consume him. And yet, fragments survived because someone hesitated. Someone felt the weight of what they were destroying. Someone understood that future men might need proof that the machine existed. You are the future they imagined. This story is not about religion alone. It is about any system that claims moral authority while demanding unexamined obedience. Any institution that reframes violation as virtue. Any ideology that insists truth must submit to narrative. Power always leaves fingerprints, inconsistencies, silences, locked rooms, stories that don't quite add up. The men who remain controlled are the ones who dismiss those signs as coincidence. The men who change are the ones who follow them. You've now seen how belief can be engineered, how institutions protect themselves, and how easily truth can be buried when it threatens authority. That knowledge is not comfortable. It is not soothing. It does not make you feel righteous. It makes you alert. And alert men are difficult to rule. That is why this knowledge was dangerous in 1749. And that is why it is still dangerous now. History did not warn you because it couldn't. It was silenced. But you weren't. And once a man sees the pattern, once he understands how power truly operates, he is never quite the same again.